Very good. Thanks for attending tonight. We all want to start on time so we can leave on time, beat the snow. So thank you for attending. I'm going to just mention this once. You're all sort of sitting toward the back as you see the presentations in the front. So if you want to move up and use these chairs, feel free to do that whenever you want. As is our custom, we usually start our meetings with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if everybody could stand, please. Turn over here.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. This is our last evening presentation for the membership and the public. And we do have an event in December on the 9th. It's in February. It's a church carol sing at St. Peter's Lutheran Church on Walmore Road. And it's always been a great event. Martha Hasley leads it, and we sing some verses in German, some verses in English. The organist is there. We have a great time, and you get fed again. So if you want to come over, it's really a good time. What date was that again?
December 9th.
Good. All right. So we get the 9th. And what time?
7 o'clock.
All right. Well, so
Christmas cookies too.
that's right. Christmas cookies, German Christmas cookies. It's a great time.
And it's nice to do to come in here, because you can see what must have been like when our forefathers came and they sang those Christmas carols in our church. We'll sing the same ones they sang, so, and do it in English, like John says.
Right. So that's fun. If the members received the recent brief, that will be coming out, but I'll just give you a warning. In January, we'll be having another meeting. It'll be on the third Thursday of the month. And it'll be here, but it'll be at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And that's going to be a description of my recent visit to Germany. And I haven't decided how long it'll be, but the first part of it will talk about the German churches and the villages that we visited in the Uckermark. So that would be where all our collective ancestors came from, like Brussau, Volno, Bergholz, Grimming, just about all of them. Well, we visited 6 of them. But it's interesting to see the churches in each of these villages and what's happened to them. So that'll be in January, on the third Thursday of the month at 2. And then the following month, we're not sure yet, but it'll also be on the third Thursday at 2 because of weather and everything else. We hold those in the afternoon. Okay, so those events will be coming up. Tonight, we're proud to have Rick Falkowski as our presenter. Rick has been around the Buffalo scene for a long time. I think you've got several books on music and stuff like that.
One book on music, 2 books on history, a book on music being worked on, and 2 books on history being worked on.
So, lots.
I try to keep myself busy.
Yeah. Okay, so if anybody wants to move, feel free to. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Rick.
Ready? Guten Abend. Ich möchte sprechen an Deutsch, aber English. Did I say that right? Do you want me to speak in English or German? If you want me to speak in German, you're in trouble, because I don't know that much of it. I was standing over here trying to figure out how to say that. Well, I am part German. You know, I'm Polish, Russian, and German. In fact, my great-grandfather, maybe great-great-grandfather, supposedly was a duke in Germany. When he came to the States, he spoke German, Polish, and English. And he ended up moving to the Kaisertown area in South Buffalo. And if you remember, you always heard stories about there used to be plays in Polish in the Broadway-Filmer area. Well, he's the guy that used to put on the plays because he spoke German, Polish, and English when he got here. That's as much as I know with the German. His name was Durfert. And everybody else was Polish and Russian. And I spent 2 years in Germany during the Air Force, which I loved. I lived in the Bitburg area, which is the Eifel near Trier. And that was absolutely fantastic. I would have stayed there if I could have, but unfortunately, you know what the Air Force is like. Your time's up, you go back to the United States, and then we're gonna send you wherever we wanna send you. And they said most likely we'll send you to Korea for a while, we'll send you to Thule, Greenland. And I said, no, that's enough, so I came back. Okay, well, anyways, the first book I ever wrote was my music book. And then I started writing history books. Now, when your group ended up getting a hold of me saying, would you like to do a talk for the German Heritage Museum? I said, wow, this would be great. Everything I was looking up, there were so many Germans from the Western New York area. I didn't believe how many. And I said, yeah, I'm gonna do a talk just on German, influence in the Western New York area. I thought it was gonna be really simple. I thought I'd go into all my different PowerPoint presentations and pull a slide out of here, a slide out of there, a slide out of there. And I'd be done in like 2 hours. Didn't happen. It ended up taking me probably 50 hours to put this presentation together. When I heard the snowstorm was coming, I was very upset, but I didn't say upset. I used different words. Okay? And in fact, I was actually thinking of threatening you, saying I'm giving the talk whether you want me to or not, after all the time that I put in. But anyways, I enjoyed putting the talk together so much, I'm actually planning on making this one of my regular talks that I'll be presenting. And but first, we're gonna have to see how it goes, because this talk's never been done before. It's on its first legs, like on its training wheels, and we're gonna see what's gonna happen. Oh, before I start my talk, I want to ask a question. How many of you had seen me speak before? One, two. Okay, very brave people to come back. Okay, and so whenever I give a talk, at the very beginning, I always say one thing. Okay, I have 3 goals. My 3 goals are, I'm going to talk about some things that you never knew. Goal number 2, I'm going to mention some things that you knew possibly in the past, but you've forgotten about. And number 3, when you leave my presentation, you're going to say, I am proud to be from Buffalo, Western New York. And today you're also going to say, I am proud to be a German American from Buffalo and Western New York. Okay, well, the other thing too is I did no reading about anything about your organization. So I'm hoping the talk that I give today is going to be different than normal talks that you've heard about German involvement in Western New York. That said, we start. Germans began arriving in Buffalo in numbers in about the 1820s. And during 1846 and 1847, there was a famine in Germany, and then there was a revolution in 1848. So this increased the number of people immigrating from Germany over to the United States. There were nearly 7,000 Germans living in Buffalo by 1850. By 1855, the city of Buffalo was half German. Now, starting in the 1830s, they settled in the Oak Elm area near Genesee Street in what became known as the Fruit Belt. That's where the Fruit Belt is located. Now, these were streets between North and Genesee Streets and Michigan and Jefferson. And the street names included names like lemon, orange, peach, cherry, grape, mulberry, rose, etc., etc. And most of the residents that lived there had fruit trees. And they also all had vegetable gardens in their backyard. In fact, I know my wife's family, they're Eldridges. And she grew up actually living someplace in the Fruit Belt before they moved to the Upper West Side. Well, the first German language newspaper in the Buffalo area was called the Weltbürger, also meaning world citizen. And that was published by a person by the name of George Zahn, starting in 1837. By the late 1800s, there were actually 10 newspapers in Western New York. The interesting thing, 5 of them were printed in English, 5 of them were printed in German. That shows you how big of a German influence there was in the Western New York area. Well, anyways, inside the first issue of the Weltbürger, they advertised that potatoes sold for 25 cents a barrel, ham was 12.5 cents a pound, butter was 16 cents a pound. The first telegraph lines between Buffalo and Albany were not connected until 1846. So this is before those lines were connected. So any news from Europe, by the time it got printed in the Buffalo paper, was 4 to 6 weeks old. And if you wanted any news from Washington, D.C., it took 8 days to get here. Now, you know what happens some places before it even happens. In fact, I actually think, watching this, I think we knew Queen Elizabeth died before she really died. They're that quick about this stuff these days. You know, and Fox and CNN are fighting who's going to be first, you know. And now, this is one thing I loved. If a subscriber could not pay their bill for their newspaper in cash, they could cover it by produce or other edible products. And also, if a person did not pay for their newspaper subscription, that person's name was published inside of the paper and they were blacklisted. When my kids had a Buffalo News route, that would have been great, because there were some people that just felt they were getting their newspaper gratis. They had no right to have to pay the bills. Well, anyways, Zahn tragically died in 1844 in Cheektowaga. Doing, you could say, a German thing. He was putting up a maypole, and the maypole ended up falling on him, and he ended up dying. His funeral was the largest in Buffalo up until that time. Well, people that settled in the Fruit Belt area were mainly skilled tradesmen, and they sold all their excess fruit and vegetables to other workers within those neighborhoods. And people in that neighborhood really depended upon public transportation. You got to realize this is the early 1800s. And so they needed a local market. And what happened is the city owned a market called the Washington Market, which opened in 1856. And this was located between Washington and Ellicott Streets, going from Chippewa to St. Michael's Church. All them streets are still there, and that area really now is just a parking lot. The brick building, you can see inside of these pictures here, housed dozens of the finest butchers in the Western New York area. And against the walls, there were stalls for poultry, butter, cheese, fruit, and vegetable vendors. The entire market was 2.5 acres, and it included vendors of assorted products in over 400 stalls. This is bigger than Superfleet, okay? And it was the largest market west of the Hudson River. Well, with all this trade happening and everything like that at the Washington Market, beginning in the 1850s, the Genesee, Ellicott, Washington, Oak Street areas became a commercial district. And German-American businesses opened in that area, such as the Henry Urban and Frank Beyer grocery store, Christoph Wagner's shoe store, Ambruser's tinsmith, Swin's umbrella manufacturing, August Dot hats, Fenning tobacco, I love that one, along with a number of saloons and boarding houses. That's a surprise, saloons in a German area? Huh. Okay. One of the first successful large businesses started there was started by George Urban. Well, in 1835, a 15-year-old George Urban Sr. arrived in Buffalo with his parents. His parents were Philip Jacob Urban and Catherine Goss Urban. His maternal grandfather, George Goss, was actually one of the first German settlers in the Buffalo area. He came here all the way back in 1828. Well, George Sr. opened a wholesale flour business at the corner of Oak and Genesee Streets in 1846. His son joined him in the business, and they opened a flour mill across the street in 1882. And there's some pictures of the two individuals and the mills. And this was followed in 1903 by the Kerr Street Mill, which was built right around the New York Central Beltline Railway. They should have kept that. If you ever looked at that Beltline Railway, the way it circled the city and everything like that, that was better than any subway that we could have had in the Western New York area. And Urban had the first mill in Buffalo that was completely powered by electricity. In fact, he was good friends with Edison. And Urban was also a principal in the Buffalo General Electric Company, a number of other companies, a land developer, and of course George Urban Boulevard in Cheektowaga and Depew was named after him. The first German Protestant divine service in Buffalo was held all the way back in 1828 in a room over the Kearns and Handel Grocery on the east side of Maine near Genesee Street. In February of 1832, the first German evangelical Lutheran congregation was organized, and in September of 1835, they put in a cornerstone for St. John's Lutheran Church. That church was dedicated on Hickory Street, and it was between William and Broadway. Reverend Johannes Andres August Grabau, am I pronouncing that right? Because I think he had something to do with Bergholz. Immigrated from Prussia, and in 1839, he formed the Old Trinity Lutheran Church at Goodell and Main Street. He served as pastor for 40 years. And also in 1843, about 800 Prussian Lutherans came to Western New York. And where did they settle? Bergholz. Okay. Well, the Ebenezers were a group of Huguenots and German Lutherans that immigrated from the Alsace region of France. And that was really a German-speaking area. In fact, Germany regained the Alsace-Lorraine area. That was one of the contentious things during World War I, World War II. And they were led by a Christian Mertz. And they originally settled on both sides of the Niagara River. And in 1843, they located in what's now West Seneca, forming the Ebenezer colonies of the Community of True Inspiration. Now, here they lived in a communal community where the assets of their labors from farming and textiles were shared. And they all lived in their own homes with one difference. They had dined in communal kitchens. So people didn't have to do the cooking, okay? I retired early because my wife has some medical issues. So after I retired, I had to learn how to cook. Well, I rushed getting here today because I had to do the cooking before I came. Okay, so, if I had a communal kitchen, I would have got here earlier. Okay. Well, anyways, they ended up purchasing that land from David Ogden of the Ogden Company at $10 an acre for 5,000 acres. Great price. Okay. And this purchase was contested by the Seneca Indians of the Seneca Creek Reservation. And the Ebenezer originally had to pay an annual allowance also to the Senecas. So they hired an attorney. Who did they hire as their attorney? Millard Fillmore before he was president. So Millard Fillmore ended up representing them in negotiations with the Seneca. They ended up finally getting uncontested titles to the lands, and the Seneca ended up moving to Salamanca. But that area, the Buffalo Creek Casino, was why we have the casino in downtown Buffalo, because that was originally Seneca land. By 1854, the Ebenezer colony could no longer expand, because Buffalo was growing. So they started moving to the Amana colonies in Iowa. And this was a very gradual move completed by the end of the Civil War. And the 5,000 acres that they owned in West Seneca was subdivided and sold predominantly to German immigrants. And several of the original Ebenezer buildings remain in that area. And also the Birchfield Nature Park. That's where Birchfield has a bunch of his paintings up. That is on the Ebenezer land. And there's actually a cemetery inside of the Ebenezer land where the early members of the community were buried. Well, the land to build the first Catholic church in Buffalo was donated in 1829 by Louis Stephen Lecontrelux. I can't speak French. In fact, I made a big mistake when I was in Europe. I went to Paris, and I got into the subway system, and I had to get line 4. Or was it line 2? I don't know. Well, anyways, so I couldn't speak any French. So I asked in English. Everybody had a deaf ear. So I asked in Spanish, because I took Spanish in high school. Nobody understood. I asked in German. Did I get a dirty look? When I got back to the base, I told some of the German guys that I worked with, I was in the subway system, and I asked in German, how do I get to the certain place? They said, you're lucky you weren't pushed into the subway. I didn't know that, okay? Well, anyways, that Frenchman was a French nobleman who opened the first pharmacy in Buffalo. But German Catholics and French Catholics and Irish Catholics all worked together to build a log church at the corner of Main and Edward Street. That church was originally called the Lamb of God Church and later was renamed St. Louis Church. But due to controversy among the parishioners, over what language the sermon was going to be in, the Irish and later the French ended up leaving. And St. Louis became a predominantly German church that battled with control over the church with the Catholic Bishop of Buffalo. And that was the Irish Bishop Timon. Okay? And the bishop even closed the church for 2 years because the Germans wouldn't let him use the rectory. Okay? Well, so what happened is they ended up building a second church. Okay, that's on the far left-hand side. That's church number 2 of St. Louis, which preceded the beautiful St. Louis that's there today. And this is made out of stone and bricks, and it was built all the way back in 1843. Well, they wanted to enlarge the church. Bishop Timon said no. Bishop Timon ended up going to the Vatican for something. So when he was gone, they expanded the church. When he came back, he excommunicated all of them. Okay? But anyways, everything got okay, That church burned down and a new current church was built. And when they went to build the new church, the initial donation to finance the church was from Gerhard Lang. Of course, the beer brewer would be the one that would have to do everything for the church. Okay, St. Anne's Church was founded by German immigrants, that's St. Anne's in the middle, in 1858, because they started moving away from downtown Buffalo out into the rural east side of Buffalo. Can you imagine Broadway and Emsley being a rural area in Buffalo? Okay, and this is an example of the Gothic architecture. I remember seeing that church with, the big steeples once when I was really little, and they were later removed. But in the early 20th century, St. Anne's School was the largest of any public, private, or parochial school in the entire western New York area. And if you saw on the news today, the Catholic Diocese just sold St. Anne's Church, and it's going to become a mosque. It shows you how everything has changed within the city of Buffalo. And originally an Orthodox congregation that met in the home of one of its founders on Oak Street in 1853, Temple Beth Zion became a Reformed congregation in 1863. And when they became a Reformed congregation, the liturgy was in German and English. They moved to a permanent synagogue in 1864 and built this iconic dome structure on Delaware Avenue in 1890. That burned down. It's next to the 20th Century Club on Delaware, and they got their current very modern synagogue that was built totally different than, what was there then. Well, St. John Newman, you don't really think of him as German, do you? But he was actually half Czechoslovakian and half German, and he wanted to become a priest. But in Europe at that time, there was an overage of priests. So they said to him, go to America. So he went to America. He was ordained a priest at St. Patrick's in New York City. Did you ever see St. Patrick's in New York City? It's all these big buildings around there, and there's this church, and it's a big church, but it looks so small. And I was thinking, St. Patrick's, wow, it's going to be huge. And the person I was with said, that's St. Patrick's. I said, it is. Amazing. I was stunned. I said, the only two things that I remember about going there was seeing St. Patrick's Cathedral and that girl taking me to the spot where John Lennon was shot. I guess she considered that the most important things in New York City. Well, anyways, Newman ended up coming to Buffalo in Western New York because he was going to minister to all the German and other immigrants in this area, because Father Newman spoke 8 different languages. Now, instead of residing in St. Louis and Buffalo, he decided to move to St. Peter and Paul's in Williamsville. There wasn't any rectory there. Okay, so he stayed at people's homes, and he possibly had a room at the Eagle House. That's a great restaurant right on Main Street in Williamsville. And I know why he would have. They serve really good German beer there. Well, and he would go around saying Mass and teaching school, and he traveled by foot or by horse to cover his ministry. His ministry was from Lake Ontario to Batavia to the Pennsylvania border. Talk about having a big area to cover. And so when he traveled, he'd stay at people's homes and at different taverns, visiting the sick and teaching. A lot of times he'd say Mass at kitchen tables. And he was also pastor at St. John the Baptist in North Bush. Where's North Bush? Tonawanda. And he stayed there until 1840. Now, Newman believed all Catholics should be educated by Catholics. So when he was appointed the Bishop of Philadelphia in 1852, he established the first Catholic school system in the United States. And he ended up building over 200 schools. He was canonized a saint in 1977. And he was the first American male saint. And where did he live? Right in Williamsville and Tonawanda. Well, the German Americans formed social clubs called the Turnverein. And this was functioned as a community center and a gymnasium. So I guess this would be a Turnverein where we are today. Well, the first Turnverein was in 1853. It was inside of Roth's Hall, which was on Michigan and Cypress. And they ended up then moving to Gillig's Hall at 249 Genesee Street in 1854. And the first singing society that Germans started here was the Lieder Tafel, which was formed in 1848. And the first Sangerbund was formed in the home of Charles Dorn, as pictured here, on the corner of Cherry and Maple. If you're really interested in a lot of the early German music and taverns and everything like that, I cover a lot of that in my music book. I cover all the different styles of music, but I also cover all the different ethnic music and everything along that line. Well, the first Buffalo Sangerfest was performed. It was called the Feast of Song. It was held in Cleveland in 1859. Well, a Buffalo group went there and they said, we'd like to host the 1860 Sangerfest in Buffalo. So on July 23rd of 1860, the Song Festival began with an opening concert at St. James Hall, which is the building there on the left-hand side, under the direction of Julius Movis. After the opening ceremony, singers were picked up and carried through the streets of Buffalo. They were all very festively decorated. Well, at this time, Buffalo only had 80,000 people. And we didn't have like a big location to hold the main concerts for the festival. So the train depot, which you can see there for New York Central, that was changed into a concert hall for the main concerts. The acoustics were perfect. Probably like singing in a big shower or something like that. You always sound better. And railway business was conducted during intermissions. So I guess if a train came in and somebody was singing, they wouldn't have to, they couldn't embark until the song ended. You know? And the Germans were the largest immigrant group in the United States. And there was over 176,000 Union soldiers that were in the Civil War that were born in Germany. And there was over 500,000 soldiers in the Union Army during the Civil War that were either first, second, or third generation immigrants serving for the Union. However, this is something I always heard, and I found out when I did my research it's not true. It isn't true that after the American Revolution, the German language was almost adopted as the official language of the United States. That's a fallacy. It was a vote on something else. Because truthfully, at that time, at the end of the American Revolution, only 9% of the US population was German. And people weren't revolting to change everything. They didn't want social change. They just didn't want to be part of England anymore. So the story, my mind was blown. I always thought that we were almost German, okay? Well, Louis Becker immigrated from Darmstadt, Germany to Buffalo in 1834 with his parents. He was a Lutheran. He anglicized his name to Baker from Becker. And he married Carolyn Donnellan, an Irish Catholic. Their son, Nelson Baker, was a member of the 74th Regiment of the New York Militia. That's now the Connecticut Street Armory in Buffalo, just to know what unit it was. And he served during the Civil War. Well, Nelson Becker was baptized as a Lutheran, but he attended church with his mother and became a Catholic at the age of 9. His brothers and father all remained Lutherans. And he didn't become a priest until he was 34 years old. And he transformed the reformatory at Limestone Hill, because that's what Lackawanna was called at that time, to the Our Lady of Victory Orphanage Hospital and Basilica. So this former Lutheran was named the Venerable Father Baker and is on his road to sainthood. Now, do you remember when you were kids, if you didn't behave, where were your parents sending you? To Father Baker's. How many of you knew that Father Baker was part German? No? Yes? I didn't when I started researching this, you know. Well, William Hangerer was very German, okay? He was born in Württemberg, Germany, and he moved with his parents to Pittsburgh when he was 10. After he completed his education, he relocated to Buffalo in 1861, got a job working at a store in Lower Main Street called Sherman and Barnes at $6 a week. Big money. But he enlisted in the 21st New York Volunteers, which was the first unit from Buffalo to serve on the front lines of the Civil War. After he got out of the Army, he came back to Buffalo and he joined Barnes and Bancroft, which became Barnes and Hangerer in 1885, and then finally the William Hangerer Company in 1895. It was one of the largest department stores between New York and Chicago, and they had, at the turn of the century, over 600 employees and over $4 million in annual sales. Well, in 1903, the store moved to a new building, the one that we all know, at 465 Main Street, which was the site of the former Tift House. And 5 of his sons continued the business. Hangerer's was the first department store to move from downtown Buffalo to the suburbs. And Hangerer's later became Sibley's, Kaufman's, and eventually Macy's. Hangerer also started the Lutheran Church Home, which continues today as Greenfield's Continuing Care in Lancaster. Now, the second Singerfest was held in Buffalo, took place in 1883. Mayor Philip Becker and businessman Jacob Shulikoff were the individuals responsible for bringing the festival to Buffalo. And they built the first music hall in the southwest corner of Main and Edward Streets, right across from St. Louis Church. The festival was a great success, but unfortunately, the music hall burned down 2 years later. In 1885, it was rebuilt. It became the Tech Theater. Now, the Tech Theater's been torn down. What's where the Tech Theater was? A grass space. It's a shame some of these great things that we lost in Buffalo. There was a third Singerfest, and that was held in Buffalo during the Pan American Exhibition. It was sponsored by the North American German Singing Society and was financed by the Buffalo Singerfest Company. They sold 1,600 chairs at $25 a share. The event was so large that it was held in the 74th Regiment Armory, now the Connecticut Street Armory. And the main concert included, you ready for this? 40 singing societies with over 2,000 singers in a hall with a capacity for 10,000 people. Now that's a singing festival, let me tell you, okay? Philip Becker, who we mentioned, was the first German-born immigrant elected mayor of Buffalo. He served 3 terms, 76, 86, and 88. Well, he arrived in Buffalo in 1847 when he was 17 years old, and he took a position as a grocery clerk at Jacob Draugh's store for $4 a month. 7 years later, he opened a delicatessen on Main near Court Street, which became one of the largest wholesale groceries in New York State. Becker founded the German Insurance Company in 1869 and remained president until his death in 1898. And he was on the committee that built City Hall at 92 Franklin Street. City Hall is now County Hall. Originally, it was City Hall and County Hall. And he lived in a mansion on West Mohawk, and then he decided to build that modest home over there at 543 Delaware near Allen Street. Well, his neighbor across the street was Jacob Shulikoff. He lived at 553. And Becker was certified to be the 3rd millionaire to live in Buffalo. Well, Shulikoff, who we mentioned, okay, he was trained in the tanning trade by his father in Germany. When he arrived in the United States in 1841, he did not speak any English. In 1844, he ended up moving to Buffalo. His relatives gave him $800 and he opened up a leather shop in downtown Buffalo. He started out buying tanneries all the way from Buffalo to Chicago. That's one of his tanneries in Buffalo. That building still stands in the Canal Street area of Buffalo. And his largest was this one in Buffalo, which was a sheepskin tannery on Mississippi, Perry, and Scott Streets. He then started investing in flour mills. That's the top picture on the right. And his flour mills were in Black Rock. All the flour mills were not on Buffalo River or Buffalo Creek. They were also in the Black Rock area. And Shulikoff's business idea was, you buy a business, you make it successful, you sell it for a profit, and then you buy another one, okay? Well, what he did is he purchased a mill in Niagara Falls, and that's when he became aware of the hydroelectric power potential of Niagara Falls. In 1877, he bought the Niagara Falls Canal Company at a bankruptcy auction for $71,000.